Sometimes the most devastating truths come not from enemies, but from those sworn to protect us. In the heart of one of Britain's most guarded royal residences, a young prince's world was about to shatter with just 7 words whispered by a longtime palace guard. What began as an ordinary rainy Tuesday afternoon would become the moment William learned that everything he believed about his family was built on carefully constructed lies. The sound of expensive luggage hitting wet gravel would echo through the palace courtyard, but it would pale in comparison to the echo of a son's anguished cry that would haunt the halls of power for years to come. This is the story of how one moment of truth changed everything, and how the walls meant to protect the royal family became the very barriers that tore them apart. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. But when palace walls have ears, and loyalty has its limits, even the most carefully guarded truths have a way of breaking free. What you're about to read isn't just a story about royalty, it's about the universal pain of discovering that the people you trust most have been hiding the very foundations of your identity. The rain that fell that day wasn't just washing the London streets. It was washing away years of pretense, protocol, and the fragile peace that had held a fractured family together. And, at the center of it all stood a young man whose entire understanding of love, family, and belonging was about to be rewritten in the span of a single, earth-shattering revelation. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday at Clarence House. William Charles Arthur Philip Lewis stood by the tall windows of his private study, watching the London fog slowly lift from the manicured gardens below. At 28 years old, he had grown accustomed to the weight of his future crown, but lately, something felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension in the palace that he couldn't quite identify, like the feeling you get before a thunderstorm when the air becomes thick and electric. His morning routine had been disrupted by several hushed conversations that ended abruptly whenever he entered a room. Staff members who had known him since childhood suddenly seemed unable to meet his eyes. Even Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had always treated him with warm familiarity, had been unusually formal during their brief exchange about dinner arrangements. William had learned long ago to read the subtle language of palace politics. Growing up in the fishbowl of royal life had taught him to notice the smallest changes in atmosphere, the way conversation shifted when he walked into a room, the difference between genuine respect and the kind of careful deference that meant people were hiding something. Today, that familiar instinct was working overtime. The previous evening's dinner had been particularly strange. His father, Prince Charles, had been distracted throughout the meal, repeatedly checking his phone and excusing himself for what he claimed were urgent calls about estate matters. Camilla, who had been part of their family dynamic for several years now, seemed nervous in a way that was completely unlike her usual composed demeanor. She kept glancing between William and his father, as if she were waiting for something to happen or for someone to say something important. What bothered William most was the way the household staff had been behaving. These were people who had worked for the royal family for decades, some of them since before he was born. They knew how to maintain their professional boundaries while still showing genuine care for the family they served. But, lately, there had been something different in their expressions when they looked at him. It wasn't pity exactly, but it was close enough to make him uncomfortable. Thomas Garrett, one of the senior protection officers who had been with the family for over 20 years, had been particularly odd in his behavior. Thomas had always been more than just a bodyguard to William. During the difficult years following his mother's death, Thomas had been one of the few people who could make him laugh, who could distract him from the weight of grief and public scrutiny. Thomas had taught him how to throw a proper punch, how to read people's intentions, and how to spot trouble before it found him. But, for the past week, Thomas had been avoiding him. Not in any obvious way that would attract attention from other staff members or security personnel, but in the subtle way that someone does when they're carrying a burden they're not sure how to share. Their usual easy banter had been replaced by formal exchanges about schedules and security protocols. When William had tried to engage him in their typical friendly conversation about football or current events, Thomas had found excuses to cut the discussions short. The rain had started around 10 in the morning, a steady London drizzle that seemed to match the gloomy atmosphere that had settled over the residence. William had spent most of the morning in meetings with his private secretary, discussing upcoming engagements and charitable commitments, but his mind kept wandering to the strange undercurrent of tension he couldn't shake. His relationship with Camilla had always been complicated, but over the years they had found a way to coexist peacefully. She wasn't his mother, and she had never tried to replace Diana in that role, which William appreciated. Their relationship was cordial, respectful, and generally pleasant. She had brought his father happiness during some very dark years, and, for that, William was grateful, even if he couldn't bring himself to feel the kind of deep affection that might have developed under different circumstances. Camilla had her own way of caring for the family, though it was very different from his mother's approach. Where Diana had been emotional and intuitive, Camilla was practical and steady. She remembered birthdays, ensured that family traditions were maintained, and had a remarkable ability to diffuse tension with humor when family gatherings became too formal or stilted. She had never overstepped boundaries or tried to impose herself as a maternal figure, which had made it possible for William to accept her presence in their lives. But, lately, even that careful balance had felt different. Camilla had been more attentive than usual, asking about his well-being in a way that felt less casual and more concerned. She had been making special efforts to include him in family discussions, seeking his opinion on matters that she would normally handle independently. It was the kind of behavior that suggested she was trying to strengthen their relationship in preparation for something difficult. The afternoon brought a brief break in the rain, and William decided to take a walk through the gardens. The fresh air helped clear his head, but it also gave him time to think more deeply about the patterns he had been noticing. As someone who had grown up in the public eye, he had developed a keen sense for when people were managing information around him. It was a survival skill in a world where every interaction could potentially become headline news. Walking along the familiar paths where he had played as a child, William found himself thinking about his mother. Diana's death had taught him that the people you love most can disappear from your life without warning, leaving behind questions that might never be answered. It had also taught him that the official version of events isn't always the complete truth, and that sometimes the most important information is the hardest to obtain. The memory of those difficult months after Diana's death brought back the feeling of being surrounded by adults who were all trying to protect him from something, who spoke in careful euphemisms and managed his access to information about what had really happened. He had hated that feeling of being treated like a child who couldn't handle the truth, and he had promised himself that he would never let people manage him that way again. But now, walking through the rain-soaked gardens of his family home, he was getting that same familiar feeling. The adults around him were once again speaking in careful code, managing information, and treating him like someone who needed to be protected from the truth. The realization made him angry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. By the time he returned to the house, William had made a decision. Whatever was happening, whatever people were trying to shield him from, he was going to find out. He was tired of being managed and protected and treated like a delicate flower that might wilt if exposed to harsh realities. He was a grown man, heir to the throne, and he deserved to know what was causing the strange atmosphere that had settled over his family. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. As he was changing out of his wet clothes, he heard voices in the corridor outside his room. One of them belonged to Thomas Garrett, and the other was a voice he recognized as belonging to Detective Chief Inspector Morrison, one of the senior law enforcement officials who occasionally consulted with palace security on sensitive matters. Their conversation was too quiet for him to make out specific words, but the tone was serious and urgent. William crept closer to his door, trying to catch fragments of what they were discussing. He heard his own name mentioned several times, along with words that made his stomach clench with anxiety: investigation, evidence, and, most troubling of all, truth about his parentage. The phrase hit him like a physical blow. Parentage. The word suggested questions about his biological origins, about who his father really was. It was the kind of word that appeared in tabloid speculation and conspiracy theories, not in serious conversations between palace security and law enforcement officials. William's hands were shaking as he pressed his ear closer to the door, straining to hear more of the conversation. But the voices were moving away, heading down the corridor toward the main staircase. He waited a few moments, then quietly opened his door and followed at a distance, staying far enough back that he wouldn't be noticed but close enough that he might overhear something useful. The two men stopped at the top of the main staircase, and their voices became slightly clearer. Thomas was saying something about 25 years of keeping this quiet and the family deserves to know. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison's response was harder to make out, but William caught the words DNA evidence and no longer possible to suppress. DNA evidence. The phrase sent ice through William's veins. DNA evidence suggested scientific proof of something that had previously been speculation or rumor. It suggested that someone had been investigating questions about his biological parentage and had found concrete answers. William retreated to his room, his mind racing with possibilities and implications. Everything he had noticed over the past week suddenly made sense in a new and terrifying context. The careful behavior of the staff, his father's distracted demeanor, Camilla's nervous attention, Thomas's obvious discomfort, it all pointed to a family secret that was about to be exposed. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of anxious speculation, trying to piece together fragments of overheard conversations and remembered moments that might provide clues about what was coming. His appetite disappeared entirely, and, when dinner was announced, he begged off with an excuse about having too much work to catch up on. But work was impossible. Every time he tried to focus on official papers or correspondence, his mind would drift back to those overheard fragments of conversation. DNA evidence. Investigation. Truth about parentage. The words played on repeat in his head, each repetition making him feel more anxious and more isolated. As evening fell and the rain continued to pound against the windows of Clarence's house, William realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Whatever truth was about to be revealed, it was clear that the people around him had been preparing for this moment for some time. He was the only one who had been kept in the dark, the only one who was about to be blindsided by information that everyone else apparently already knew. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, heir to one of the most powerful thrones in the world, and he was the last person in his own household to learn the truth about his own identity. Tomorrow, he sensed, would bring answers to questions he had never thought to ask, and those answers would change everything he believed about himself and his family. The storm outside was just beginning, but William had no idea that the real tempest was still to come. The morning of March 16 dawned gray and drizzling, as if London itself was reflecting the heavy atmosphere that had settled over Clarence's house. William had barely slept, his mind churning with fragments of overheard conversations and growing certainty that his world was about to shift in ways he couldn't control or predict. He had always prided himself on being observant, on reading the subtle cues that revealed what people were really thinking beneath their polite exteriors. Growing up royal had taught him to notice the difference between genuine warmth and calculated charm, between sincere concern and political maneuvering. But now, as he moved through his morning routine under the watchful eyes of staff members who seemed to know something he didn't, William felt like he was seeing his own life from the outside for the first time. The breakfast room felt different that morning. His father was already seated at the long mahogany table, buried behind the Times in a way that seemed more like hiding than reading. Camilla was making an unusual effort with the meal, personally ensuring that William's coffee was exactly how he liked it and offering him selections from the morning's fresh pastries with the kind of nervous attention that suggested she was trying to create a buffer of normalcy around whatever storm was approaching. "You seem tired, darling," Camilla said, her voice carrying a note of concern that felt genuine but also somehow rehearsed. "Perhaps you should consider a lighter schedule today." William studied her face, looking for clues about what she might know. Camilla had always been skilled at managing difficult conversations and smoothing over family tensions, but today there was something different in her demeanor. She was trying too hard to appear casual, and the effort was showing around the edges of her usual composed exterior. "I'm fine," William replied, accepting the coffee but leaving the pastries untouched. His appetite had disappeared completely, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that made the thought of food impossible. "Just have a lot on my mind lately." Prince Charles lowered his newspaper slightly, his eyes meeting William's over the top of the financial section. The look that passed between them was loaded with unspoken communication, the kind of complex emotional exchange that happens between family members who know each other well enough to communicate in glances and subtle shifts in expression. "Perhaps we should talk later," Charles said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of a conversation that had been delayed too long. "There are some matters we need to discuss privately." The words hung in the air like a challenge or a threat, depending on how you interpreted them. William felt his pulse quicken, knowing instinctively that this was the moment he had been unconsciously preparing for since the strange atmosphere had settled over the household. "What kind of matters?" William asked, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. He had learned long ago that direct questions often yielded more information than diplomatic dancing around sensitive topics. Charles and Camilla exchanged a look that confirmed William's suspicions that they had been discussing him extensively when he wasn't present. It was the kind of loaded glance between partners who have already had multiple conversations about a difficult topic and are now trying to decide how much to reveal and when. Family matters, Charles said finally, folding his newspaper with careful deliberation. Things that have been complicated for a long time. William felt a flash of irritation at the euphemistic language. Complicated was the word adults used when they wanted to avoid giving children the full truth about divorce, death, or scandal. It was diplomatic language designed to manage and control information rather than provide real answers. "I'd prefer it if you spoke plainly," William said, his voice carrying an edge that surprised even him. "I'm not a child anymore, and I can handle whatever you need to tell me." The silence that followed was heavy with tension and unspoken implications. William could see his father wrestling with how much to reveal and how to frame whatever conversation was coming. Camilla was watching both men with the careful attention of someone who knew she was about to witness a potentially explosive family confrontation. "Very well," Charles said finally, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when discussing matters of state or making official pronouncements. "Thomas Garrett has requested to speak with you this morning. There are some things he feels you should know directly from him rather than hearing them secondhand." The mention of Thomas sent another spike of anxiety through William's chest. If Thomas was requesting a private conversation, it meant that whatever he had to share was significant enough to override the usual protocols about how sensitive information was communicated within the royal family hierarchy. "What kind of things?" William pressed, his patience for euphemisms and careful language finally exhausted. "What does Thomas know that requires a private conversation?" Charles looked genuinely pained, as if the words he needed to say were physically difficult to produce. "Information about your mother. About the circumstances surrounding your birth. About things that have been kept private for your protection." The words hit William like a series of physical blows. Information about his mother suggested revelations about Diana that had been hidden from him for his entire adult life. Circumstances surrounding his birth implied questions about his biological parentage that went beyond normal family complexity. Things kept private for his protection meant that multiple people had been making decisions about his life and identity without his knowledge or consent. "How long have you known?" William asked, his voice quiet but carrying an undercurrent of anger that surprised everyone at the table, including himself. "That's complicated," Charles began, but William cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Stop saying complicated. Just tell me how long you've known whatever it is that Thomas needs to tell me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken tension and carefully managed information. William could see his father struggling with how much truth to reveal and how to frame it in a way that wouldn't destroy their relationship entirely. "We've suspected certain things for many years," Charles said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we've only had confirmation recently." "Scientific confirmation. Scientific confirmation." The phrase echoed the DNA evidence that William had overheard in yesterday's conversation between Thomas and the detective. It suggested that speculation and rumor had been replaced by concrete, undeniable proof of something that would change how William understood his own identity. "And you decided to keep this from me?" William asked, standing up from the table with enough force that his chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. "You decided that I didn't deserve to know the truth about my own life?" Camilla spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice gentle but firm. "We wanted to protect you, William. The truth is difficult. And the implications could be devastating for the family and for the monarchy." William turned to look at her, really seeing her for the first time in years. Camilla had always been the practical voice in family discussions, the one who considered political implications and public relations consequences before making decisions. But now, looking at her carefully composed expression, William realized that she had been part of keeping him in the dark about his own identity. "The monarchy," William repeated, his voice heavy with bitter irony. "Always the monarchy. Even when it comes to basic truth about who someone really is." "That's not fair," Charles said, but his protest lacked conviction. They all knew that the monarchy's stability and reputation had always taken precedence over individual comfort or personal truth within the royal family. William felt something shifting inside him, a fundamental change in how he understood his relationship with his family and his role within the institution of royalty. All his life, he had accepted that personal desires and individual needs came second to duty and public service. But learning that his own identity had been managed and controlled without his knowledge felt like a betrayal that went beyond normal royal expectations. "When is Thomas planning to share this information with me?" William asked, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when addressing staff members rather than family. "This afternoon," Charles replied. "He's been struggling with how to approach this conversation. Thomas has known you since you were a child, and this isn't easy for him either." The mention of Thomas's emotional struggle reminded William that whatever revelation was coming would affect more than just his own understanding of his identity. Thomas had been a constant presence throughout his childhood and adolescence, one of the few people who had provided stability and continuity during the difficult years after his mother's death. If Thomas was struggling with how to share this information, it meant that the truth was significant enough to potentially damage their relationship. William left the breakfast room without another word, needing space to process what he had learned and prepare himself for whatever conversation was coming with Thomas. As he walked through the familiar corridors of his family home, he found himself looking at portraits and photographs with new eyes, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind the carefully composed public images of royal family life. His mother's presence was everywhere in the house, preserved in formal portraits and candid photographs that captured moments of genuine happiness and spontaneous affection. Diana had been the emotional heart of their family, the person who had insisted on normalcy and authenticity even within the constraints of royal protocol. Looking at her image now, William felt a complex mix of love, loss, and growing anger at the possibility that important truths about her life had been kept from him. The hours between breakfast and his scheduled conversation with Thomas felt endless. William tried to occupy himself with routine work, reviewing correspondence and preparing for upcoming public engagements, but his concentration was completely shattered. Every few minutes, his mind would drift back to fragments of overheard conversations and the growing certainty that his understanding of his own family history was about to be fundamentally altered. Lunch was a tense, quiet affair. Charles and Camilla made polite conversation about mundane topics, but the undercurrent of approaching revelation made every interaction feel artificial and strained. William found himself studying their faces, looking for clues about what they knew and how long they had been keeping secrets from him. By mid-afternoon, the rain had intensified into a proper storm, with wind rattling the windows and water streaming down the glass in steady sheets. The weather seemed appropriate for what William sensed would be a day of emotional upheaval and fundamental change. Thomas Garrett arrived at Clarence House at exactly 3 o'clock, his usual punctuality now carrying additional weight since William knew this wasn't a routine security briefing. Thomas looked older than usual, as if the weight of whatever he needed to share had aged him over the course of the week. "Your Highness," Thomas said formally when he was shown into William's private study, but his voice carried the kind of emotional strain that suggested this conversation was going to be anything but formal. "Please sit down, Thomas," William said, gesturing to one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace rather than maintaining the usual professional distance of desk-based meetings. "And, please, let's skip the formal protocols today. I think we're past that point." Thomas nodded gratefully, settling into the chair with obvious relief at being given permission to drop some of the ceremonial requirements of their usual interactions. For a few moments, they sat in silence, listening to the rain against the windows and the crackle of the fire. "This is going to be difficult," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying 20 years of accumulated affection and respect for the young man he had helped raise. "I've been dreading this conversation for weeks, but I can't keep this information to myself any longer." William felt his stomach clench with anticipation and dread. Whatever Thomas was about to tell him, it was clear that it was going to change everything he believed about himself and his family. The storm outside seemed to intensify as if the weather itself was preparing for the emotional tempest that was about to unfold within the walls of Clarence House. Thomas Garrett had faced dangerous situations throughout his career in royal protection. He had dealt with credible threats, managed security crises, and handled sensitive diplomatic situations that required split-second decisions and absolute discretion. But, sitting in William's private study on that rainy March afternoon, he felt more nervous than he had in 20 years of high-stakes professional challenges. The young man sitting across from him had grown from the grieving 15-year-old boy he had helped comfort after Diana's death into a confident, thoughtful adult who commanded respect and carried himself with natural authority. Thomas had watched William navigate the complex demands of royal life with grace and intelligence, always wondering when this conversation would become inevitable. "I need you to understand," Thomas began carefully, "that everything I'm about to tell you comes from a place of deep respect and affection for you and for your mother's memory. This isn't about damaging anyone or causing harm. It's about truth that can no longer be hidden." William leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on Thomas's words. The formality of the setting seemed to dissolve as the two men prepared to have the kind of honest conversation that had been building between them for years. "For the past several months," Thomas continued, "there has been an investigation. Not a public investigation, but a private inquiry commissioned by certain members of Parliament who have been concerned about questions that have persisted since your birth. Questions about royal succession and legitimate bloodlines." The words hit William like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain silent and let Thomas continue. He had asked for truth, and now he was going to receive it, regardless of how difficult it might be to hear. "Your mother," Thomas said, his voice becoming gentler, "was an extraordinary woman who found herself in an impossible situation. Her marriage to your father was troubled from very early on, and, by the time you were conceived, they were essentially living separate lives." William felt something cold settling in his stomach as he began to understand where this conversation was heading. The implications were becoming clear, but he needed to hear the words spoken directly before he could fully process what they meant for his identity and his future. "During that period," Thomas continued, "your mother formed a close relationship with someone outside the royal circle. Someone who provided her with emotional support and companionship during a very difficult time in her marriage." The euphemistic language was frustrating, but William understood that Thomas was trying to deliver devastating information in the gentlest way possible. Still, the diplomatic phrasing felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was being revealed. "Who?" William asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the windows. Thomas took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for the most difficult part of his revelation. "Major James Hewitt. He was your mother's writing instructor initially, but their relationship became much more personal and lasted for several years." The name hit William like a lightning bolt. James Hewitt had always been a peripheral figure in stories about his mother, someone mentioned occasionally in tabloid speculation but never given serious consideration in official family narratives. But now, hearing Thomas speak the name in this context, William felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in ways that were both illuminating and terrifying. "The timeline," William said slowly, working through implications that were almost too large to process. "You're saying that when I was conceived?" "The DNA evidence confirms it," Thomas said gently but firmly. "Prince Charles is not your biological father, William. James Hewitt is." The words hung in the air between them like an explosion that continued to reverberate long after the initial impact. William felt as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly disappeared, leaving him falling through space with no reference points or solid foundations to grab onto. Everything he had believed about his identity, his place in the royal family, his right to inherit the throne, his understanding of his mother's life, all of it was suddenly revealed as based on carefully constructed fiction rather than biological reality. The revelation was so complete and so devastating that for several moments, William couldn't find words to respond. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice sounding strange and distant even to his own ears. "I've suspected for years," Thomas admitted. "The physical resemblance between you and Major Hewitt became more obvious as you grew older. And your mother, there were things she said during emotional moments, especially in the months before her death, that suggested she was carrying a tremendous burden of guilt and secrecy." William stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the storm that seemed to mirror the chaos erupting in his mind. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the usually pristine palace grounds into a muddy, gray landscape that reflected his internal emotional state.
Why now? William asked without turning around.
Why are you telling me this now instead of taking this secret to your grave? Thomas's voice carried genuine pain as he explained.
Because there are people who know the truth, and they're planning to use it. Political enemies of the monarchy who want to destabilize the institution by revealing that the heir to the throne is not legitimate.
If this information becomes public without your knowledge, you'll be completely unprepared for the fallout.
The political implications were staggering.
If William's parentage became public knowledge, it would create a constitutional crisis unlike anything the British monarchy had faced in modern times. Questions about royal succession, legitimate bloodlines, and the right to inherit the throne would dominate political discourse and potentially threaten the stability of the entire institution.
Does my father know?
William asked, still staring out at the storm. Prince Charles has known the truth about your parentage since shortly after you were born, Thomas said quietly. The decision to raise you as his son despite knowing the biological reality was made by both your parents together. This revelation added another layer of betrayal and confusion to William's emotional turmoil. Learning that Charles had known the truth for his entire life while maintaining the fiction of paternity felt like a fundamental deception that called into question every interaction they had ever had as father and son.
And Camilla?
She's known since before she married your father, Thomas confirmed. It was part of the family reality she accepted when she chose to become part of the royal household. William turned away from the window to face Thomas directly, his emotions shifting from shock and hurt toward something that felt more like anger. The realization that multiple people had been managing information about his identity for his entire life felt like a betrayal that went beyond normal family complexity. So everyone knew except me, William said, his voice carrying an edge that made Thomas visibly uncomfortable. Everyone in my own family knew the truth about who I really am, and I was the only one left in the dark. They were trying to protect you, Thomas said, but the words sounded weak even to him. And they were trying to protect the monarchy from a scandal that could have destroyed the institution. Protect me, William repeated bitterly. By lying to me about my own identity for nearly 30 years. By letting me plan my entire life around inheriting a throne that I have no legitimate right to claim. The constitutional implications were becoming clearer as William processed the information. If he was not Charles's biological son, then his claim to the throne was based entirely on legal fiction rather than bloodline inheritance. The entire foundation of his future role and responsibility was revealed as built on deception and cover-up. Thomas stood up, clearly struggling with how to respond to William's growing anger.
Your mother loved you desperately, William.
Everything she did, every choice she made, was motivated by her desire to protect you and give you the best possible life.
By lying to me? William asked, his voice rising with emotion. By creating an elaborate fiction around my entire identity?
By ensuring that you would have a father who loved you and a secure future within the royal family, Thomas replied firmly. Charles has been a father to you in every way that matters, regardless of biology. William felt his anger shifting and focusing as he processed the full scope of what had been hidden from him. It wasn't just about paternity or royal succession. It was about autonomy and truth and the right to make informed decisions about his own life based on accurate information rather than carefully managed fiction.
Where is James Hewitt now?
William asked suddenly, realizing that somewhere in the world was a man who was his biological father but had never been allowed to acknowledge that relationship. He lives quietly in Devon, Thomas said carefully. He's never publicly claimed paternity, and he's been financially compensated for his discretion over the years. The idea that his biological father had been paid to keep quiet about their relationship added another dimension of sordidness to an already devastating revelation. William began to understand that the secret of his parentage had required ongoing management and financial arrangements that extended far beyond his immediate family.
Does he know that you're telling me this today? William asked. Thomas shook his head.
Major Hewitt has been told only that certain information might become public soon and that he should be prepared for renewed media attention. He doesn't know that you've been informed directly. William walked to his desk and stood behind it, using the physical barrier to create some emotional distance from the conversation that was reshaping his understanding of everything he had believed about his life. The familiar weight of royal responsibility suddenly felt different, less like destiny and more like elaborate pretense.
What happens now?
William asked, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when discussing official business. That depends on how you want to handle this information, Thomas replied carefully. There are several options for how to proceed, and each one has different implications for you personally and for the royal family.
William realized that this conversation was not just about receiving difficult information.
It was also about making decisions that would affect the rest of his life and, potentially, the future of the British monarchy. The child who had been protected from truth was now being asked to become the adult who would decide how to handle the consequences of decades of deception. The storm outside seemed to intensify as William contemplated the enormous decisions that now lay before him. Everything he had planned and prepared for was suddenly uncertain, and the comfortable assumptions that had guided his life for nearly 30 years were revealed as carefully constructed illusions. But, beneath the shock and anger and confusion, William felt something else beginning to emerge. For the first time in his life, he was being asked to make decisions based on complete information rather than managed truth. The responsibility was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. The hour that followed Thomas's revelation passed in a blur of emotional turbulence and practical considerations that William's mind struggled to process simultaneously. As the reality of his situation began to settle in, he found himself moving between shock, anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of relief that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Thomas had left him alone to absorb the information, but not before providing additional details that made the scope of the deception even clearer. The DNA testing had been conducted secretly using samples obtained during routine medical examinations. The investigation had been triggered by questions raised in Parliament about persistent rumors regarding royal bloodlines. Most devastating of all, multiple members of his extended family had known the truth for years and had participated in maintaining the fiction of his legitimate royal parentage. William sat in his study as the afternoon light faded, staring at official documents and photographs that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The royal seal on his official correspondence seemed like a mockery, representing an authority and legitimacy that had been based on carefully constructed lies. Every formal portrait, every ceremonial event, every public appearance where he had been presented as the future king now felt like participation in an elaborate fraud. The sound of voices in the corridor outside his study alerted him that his family had returned to the residence. Through his door, he could hear Charles and Camilla speaking in the low, urgent tones that people use when discussing crisis management. Their conversation was too quiet for him to make out specific words, but the tension in their voices was unmistakable. William made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and force. He was done being managed and protected and spoken about in hushed conferences while being excluded from decisions about his own life. If his family wanted to discuss the implications of today's revelation, they could do it with him present instead of around him. He opened his study door and walked down the corridor toward the main sitting room where Charles and Camilla had settled for what was clearly intended as a private strategy session. Their conversation stopped abruptly when he appeared in the doorway, and the guilty expressions on their faces confirmed that they had been discussing how to manage the aftermath of his conversation with Thomas. "I think," William said, his voice carrying a calm authority that surprised everyone in the room including himself, "that any conversations about how to handle this situation should include me, since I'm the one most affected by it." Charles and Camilla exchanged the kind of loaded glance that married couples use to communicate complex thoughts without words. It was clear that they had been hoping for more time to develop a strategy before having to confront William's emotional reaction directly. "Of course," Charles said carefully, gesturing for William to join them. "We were just discussing the practical implications and trying to understand what our options might be." William remained standing rather than settling into one of the comfortable chairs, using his physical positioning to signal that this was not going to be a cozy family chat about minor difficulties. The formal distance felt appropriate for a conversation about constitutional crisis and fundamental deception. "Our options," William repeated, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "I find it interesting that you're still thinking in terms of our decisions when this situation exists because all of you made decisions about my life without consulting me for 3 decades. Camilla spoke for the first time since William had joined them, her voice gentle but firm. "William, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But we need to think carefully about how to move forward. This affects more than just our family. It affects the monarchy and the stability of the constitutional system. The monarchy, William said, his voice flat with exhaustion.
Always the monarchy. Even when we're talking about basic truth and honesty between family members.
Charles leaned forward in his chair, his expression showing genuine anguish.
This was never about choosing the monarchy over your well-being, William.
Every decision we made was an attempt to protect you from exactly this kind of pain and uncertainty.
By lying to me, William said bluntly. By building my entire identity around a fiction. By letting me plan my whole life around inheriting a throne that I have no legitimate claim to.
The words hung in the air between them, finally, speaking aloud the constitutional crisis that had been lurking beneath the surface of their family dynamics for years. If William was not Charles's biological son, then his position in the line of succession was legally questionable at best.
Your claim to the throne is not just about biology, Charles said carefully.
You were acknowledged as my son from birth. You've been raised and educated as heir apparent.
The legal precedents for royal succession are more complex than simple paternity.
William felt his anger flaring again at what felt like another attempt to manage and manipulate the situation rather than acknowledge the fundamental deception that had shaped his entire life.
Legal precedents, William said, his voice rising. Constitutional technicalities. Political maneuvering. Is there anything about this situation that you're willing to discuss honestly instead of through the lens of damage control?
The question seemed to hit Charles like a physical blow, and, for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked enough to show the genuine pain and guilt he had been carrying for years.
I loved your mother, Charles said quietly, his voice carrying more emotion than William had heard from him in years.
Despite all the problems in our marriage, despite the public scrutiny and the private pain, I loved her. And when she told me about James, when she told me that you might not be my biological son, I made a choice to love you anyway. The admission was so raw and unexpected that it stopped William's angry momentum entirely. In all their years of careful, polite interaction, Charles had never spoken so directly about the emotional realities behind their family's public facade. She was terrified, Charles continued, his words coming faster as if a dam had finally burst. Terrified that the truth would destroy you, would destroy the family, would create a scandal that would damage the monarchy for generations. But, more than anything, she was terrified that you would feel unwanted and illegitimate and somehow less worthy of love because of the circumstances of your conception. William felt tears beginning to blur his vision as he began to understand the impossible position his mother had been in. Diana had been trying to protect him from exactly the kind of identity crisis he was experiencing now, while also managing her own guilt about the deception and her fear of political consequences. She made me promise, Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper, to raise you as my son in every way that mattered. To never let you feel that biology determined your worth or your place in this family. And, despite everything that went wrong between Diana and me, that's one promise I kept. The emotional weight of the revelation was overwhelming, but William found that his anger was beginning to transform into something more complex. He was still furious about the deception, still felt betrayed by years of managed truth, but he was also beginning to understand the impossible choices that had created this situation. Camilla spoke again, her voice careful but determined.
The question now is how we move forward. Thomas was right that this information is going to become public soon.
People who want to damage the monarchy are preparing to use your parentage as a weapon against the institution. William walked to the window and stared out at the storm that had been raging all day. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets, and the wind was strong enough to bend the trees in the palace gardens. The weather seemed to match the emotional turbulence that was reshaping his understanding of his life and his future.
What if I don't want to move forward as if nothing has changed? William asked without turning around. What if learning the truth about my parentage makes me question whether I want to inherit the throne at all?
The silence that followed his question was so complete that the only sound in the room was the rain against the windows and the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. William had just articulated the possibility that no one in the royal family had been willing to speak aloud, that knowledge of his true parentage might lead him to abdicate his position in the line of succession.
That's your choice to make, Charles said finally,
his voice heavy with the weight of potential constitutional crisis. It always has been, regardless of biology.
The crown is not something that can be forced upon someone who doesn't want to accept its responsibilities.
William turned back to face his family, studying their expressions as they contemplated the possibility that the revelation of his parentage might lead not just to scandal but to fundamental changes in the royal succession. "I need time," William said, his voice carrying a finality that suggested the immediate family discussion was over. "I need time to process this information and to decide how I want to handle it. And I need that time without feeling pressured by political considerations or family expectations." Charles nodded, clearly recognizing that pushing for immediate decisions would likely make the situation worse rather than better. "Of course.
Take whatever time you need."
"And I want to meet him," William added suddenly, surprising everyone in the room including himself. "I want to meet James Hewitt and hear his side of this story directly." The request sent visible shock through both Charles and Camilla. The idea of William meeting his biological father represented a level of engagement with the truth that went far beyond simply acknowledging the facts of his parentage. "William," Camilla said carefully, "that could be very complicated. Major Hewitt has been living quietly for years, and involving him directly in family discussions could create additional risks for everyone involved." "Additional risks," William repeated, his voice carrying familiar frustration with euphemistic language. "You mean it could make the political situation more difficult to manage?" "I mean," Camilla said firmly, "that it could be emotionally devastating for you. Meeting your biological father after learning the truth about your parentage is not something that should be done impulsively." William felt his anger returning, but it was now focused more clearly on the ongoing attempts to manage his emotional reactions rather than on the original deception itself. "I'm not being impulsive," he said clearly. "I'm making an informed decision as an adult who has finally been told the truth about his own identity. And part of processing that truth involves understanding all the relationships and choices that created this situation." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door, followed by the appearance of Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper. Her expression was carefully neutral, but William could see tension in her posture that suggested she was carrying news that would complicate an already difficult situation. "Your Highness," she said, addressing Charles with the formal deference that palace protocol required. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development that requires your immediate attention." Charles looked exhausted as he prepared to deal with whatever crisis had now been added to their family emergency.
"What kind of development?"
"There are reporters gathering outside the main gate," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "More than usual, and they appear to be preparing for an extended vigil. Security believes they may have information about today's family discussions."
The words hit the room like another lightning strike.
If reporters were already gathering, it meant that news of the investigation into William's parentage had leaked beyond the small circle of people who were supposed to know about it. The private family crisis was about to become very public very quickly.
William felt a strange sense of relief mixed with his growing anxiety.
The period of managing secrets and controlling information was apparently coming to an end whether they were ready for it or not. Whatever decisions needed to be made about how to handle the truth would have to be made quickly, under pressure, and in full view of the public and media scrutiny that defined royal life. The storm outside was reaching its peak intensity, and William realized that the real tempest was just beginning to unfold. The news of reporters gathering outside the palace gates transformed the atmosphere in the sitting room from tense family discussion to full-scale crisis management. Within minutes, the quiet space had been invaded by private secretaries, security personnel, and communications staff who arrived with the kind of urgent efficiency that accompanies royal emergencies. William watched the familiar machinery of palace crisis response swing into action around him, feeling like he was observing the scene from a great distance. People spoke in urgent whispers about media strategy, legal implications, and damage control while he stood at the center of the storm, still processing the fundamental revelation about his identity that had started this entire crisis. Sir Malcolm Hendricks, Charles's senior private secretary, arrived with a thick folder of documents and the grim expression of someone who had been anticipating this moment for months. His presence signaled that the situation had moved beyond family discussion into the realm of constitutional crisis that required formal institutional response. Your Highness, Sir Malcolm addressed Charles with the kind of forced calm that senior civil servants use when delivering devastating news. We need to discuss our options immediately. The media appears to have significant information about Prince William's parentage, and they're preparing to publish regardless of official response. The formal use of his title in this context felt surreal to William. He was being discussed as a constitutional problem that required management rather than as a person whose life had just been fundamentally altered. The institutional machinery was already moving to protect the monarchy, and his personal emotional response was apparently a secondary consideration.
What kind of information do they have?
Charles asked, his voice taking on the clipped, official tone he used when dealing with state business. Sir Malcolm glanced nervously at William before responding, clearly uncomfortable about discussing sensitive family matters in front of the person most affected by them.
DNA evidence has apparently been leaked from the parliamentary investigation.
Several major newspapers have independent confirmation of Prince William's biological parentage and are preparing coordinated coverage. The words hit William like a series of physical blows. The private crisis that he had been given hours to process was about to become front-page news around the world. His personal identity crisis was about to be transformed into a public spectacle that would be analyzed and debated by millions of people who had no stake in his emotional well-being.
How long do we have?
Camilla asked, her practical nature immediately focusing on timeline and logistics rather than emotional implications.
Hours, not days, Sir Malcolm replied grimly. The evening editions are already being prepared. We have until approximately 6 o'clock to decide on our response strategy.
William felt something inside him snap at the casual discussion of response strategy and timeline management. His entire identity had been revealed as fiction, his biological father had been hidden from him for 3 decades, and the people around him were discussing the situation as if it were a routine public relations challenge. "Stop," William said loudly, his voice cutting through the urgent conversations that had erupted around the room.
Everyone stop talking about me as if I'm not standing right here.
The room fell silent, with all eyes turning toward William as he struggled to find words for the complex emotions that were threatening to overwhelm him. The formal distance that palace protocol usually maintained between personal feelings and institutional business had become unbearable. "This is my life we're discussing," William continued, his voice rising with emotion. "My identity, my parentage, my future. And all of you are talking about it like it's a public relations problem that needs to be solved rather than a fundamental crisis for the person who actually has to live with the consequences." Sir Malcolm looked genuinely uncomfortable, clearly unaccustomed to dealing with emotional outbursts during official crisis meetings. "Your Highness, I understand that this is difficult, but we need to focus on protecting the institution of the monarchy while we still have some control over how this information becomes public." "The institution," William repeated, his voice heavy with bitter irony.
"Always the institution. What about protecting the people who are supposed to be served by that institution?"
Charles stepped forward, clearly recognizing that the situation was moving beyond normal crisis management protocols into territory that required more personal intervention.
"William, I know this is overwhelming.
But we have a responsibility to millions of people who depend on the stability of the constitutional monarchy."
"What about your responsibility to me?"
William asked, his voice cracking with emotion.
"What about your responsibility to tell me the truth about my own life instead of managing me like a political asset?"
The question hung in the air between them, exposing the fundamental tension that had always existed between William's role as heir to the throne and his needs as a human being who deserved honesty and autonomy. The collision between personal authenticity and institutional responsibility had finally become impossible to manage diplomatically. Camilla moved closer to William, her expression showing genuine concern beneath her usual composed exterior. "We're not trying to manage you, darling. We're trying to protect you and the family from consequences that could be devastating for everyone involved." "By making decisions about my life without consulting me," William said flatly. "By treating me like a child who can't handle the truth about his own parentage." The arrival of Thomas Garrett added another dimension to the increasingly crowded room. Thomas's expression was grim, and he was carrying a tablet that clearly contained news updates about the developing media coverage. "The first online reports are already being published," Thomas announced to the room, his voice heavy with the weight of inevitable crisis. Major news outlets are coordinating their coverage for maximum impact.
This is going to be the lead story on every news program tonight.
William felt the walls of his carefully controlled life finally collapsing completely. The private revelation that he had been given hours to process was about to become global headlines that would define public discussion for weeks or months to come. His personal identity crisis was being transformed into entertainment for millions of people around the world.
But, instead of the panic or despair that everyone in the room seemed to expect, William felt something unexpected beginning to rise within him, a strange sense of liberation that came from knowing that the period of secrecy and managed information was finally ending. For better or worse, the truth was going to be public knowledge, and he would no longer have to live with the weight of unknowing deception. "I want to make a statement," William announced suddenly, his voice carrying a clear authority that surprised everyone in the room. "William," Charles said quickly, "any public statement needs to be carefully considered and coordinated with official palace communications. We can't afford to make this situation worse with impulsive responses." "Impulsive?" William asked, his voice rising again. "Learning the truth about my parentage after 30 years of deception is impulsive? Wanting to speak honestly about my own life instead of having it managed by committees is impulsive?" Sir Malcolm looked alarmed at the suggestion of an uncontrolled public statement.
"Your Highness, with respect, any public comments about this situation could have enormous constitutional implications. The succession to the throne, the legitimacy of the monarchy, the stability of the government, all of these things could be affected by how you choose to respond." William turned to face Sir Malcolm directly, his expression showing the kind of clear determination that had been building throughout the day's revelations. "Then, perhaps it's time for those implications to be addressed honestly instead of hidden behind constitutional technicalities and public relations management."
The suggestion that William might be prepared to challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying royal succession sent visible shock through the assembled staff members.
They were clearly unprepared for the possibility that knowledge of his true parentage might lead him to question not just his personal identity but his institutional role.
"What are you saying exactly?"
Charles asked carefully, his voice carrying the kind of parental concern that had been largely absent from their earlier institutional discussions. William looked around the room at the faces of people who had spent their careers managing royal crises and protecting institutional stability. These were competent, well-meaning people who genuinely believed they were serving important purposes, but their institutional perspective had made them incapable of seeing him as anything other than a problem to be managed. "I'm saying," William replied slowly, choosing his words with deliberate care, "that I'm tired of being treated like a symbol instead of a person. I'm tired of having my life managed by people who think that institutional stability is more important than individual honesty. And I'm tired of participating in a system that requires fundamental deception about who I am and where I came from." The words carried implications that went far beyond immediate crisis management. William was articulating a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that had governed his life since birth, questioning whether he wanted to continue playing the role that had been assigned to him regardless of his personal feelings about it. Camilla spoke into the tense silence that followed his statement, her voice gentle but urgent.
"William, you're processing devastating information under enormous pressure. This isn't the time to make irreversible decisions about your future." "When would be the time?" William asked pointedly. "After the media coverage dies down? After the constitutional lawyers figure out how to manage the legal implications? After everyone has decided what would be best for the monarchy and my personal feelings have been factored into the political calculation?" The question exposed the fundamental problem that had created the current crisis. William's personal autonomy and emotional well-being had always been secondary considerations in a system designed to preserve institutional stability above individual needs. Thomas stepped forward, his expression showing the kind of personal concern that went beyond professional duty. "William, your mother would want you to think carefully about this. She spent her life trying to protect you from exactly this kind of public scrutiny and constitutional crisis." The mention of his mother hit William harder than any of the other arguments that had been presented. Diana's memory had been invoked throughout the day as justification for the deception that had shaped his life, and now it was being used to encourage him to continue participating in that deception even after learning the truth.
My mother, William said quietly, his voice carrying a complex mix of love and anger, spent her life trapped in a system that valued her role more than her happiness. She died still carrying secrets that were supposed to protect the monarchy but that ultimately protected no one. The comparison between his mother's situation and his own was too painful and too accurate for anyone in the room to challenge directly. Diana had indeed been sacrificed to institutional needs, and now William was being asked to accept a similar fate in the name of constitutional stability. William walked to the window and stared out at the storm that had been raging all day. The rain was still falling heavily, and through the downpour he could see the lights of media vehicles gathering beyond the palace gates. The private crisis was about to become public spectacle, and he had to decide whether he wanted to be a passive victim of that spectacle or take some control over how his story was told. "I want to speak to Camilla alone," William said suddenly, turning back to face the room. His voice carried the kind of authority that made it clear this was not a request but a decision. The assembled staff members looked uncertain about leaving the two most directly affected family members alone during such a volatile moment, but Charles nodded his approval and gestured for everyone to file out of the sitting room. When the door closed behind the last staff member, William found himself alone with the woman who had become his stepmother under circumstances that were now revealed as far more complicated than anyone had acknowledged publicly. Camilla had known the truth about his parentage when she married his father, which meant that their entire relationship had been built on her knowledge of secrets that had been hidden from him. "You've known all along," William said, his voice carrying more exhaustion than anger. "Every conversation we've had, every family gathering, every moment when you've treated me as Charles's son, you've known it wasn't true." Camilla's composure finally cracked slightly, showing the genuine emotion that she had been carefully controlling throughout the day's crisis. "I've known the biological truth, yes. But that doesn't mean I've thought of you as anything other than Charles's son in every way that matters." "Every way that matters," William repeated. "What does that mean exactly?" "Every way except the truth?" Camilla moved closer to him, her expression showing the kind of maternal concern that she had rarely allowed herself to display so openly. "It means that love and commitment and daily care matter more than DNA. Your father has loved you and raised you and worried about you for 30 years. That makes him your father in every meaningful sense." William felt tears beginning to blur his vision as he struggled with the complex emotions that Camilla's words evoked. There was truth in what she was saying, but it was truth complicated by years of deception and managed information that had denied him the right to make his own decisions about his relationships and his identity. "But it was my right to know," William said, his voice breaking with emotion. "It was my right to understand my own history and to make choices about my life based on complete information rather than carefully constructed fiction." Camilla nodded, tears beginning to show in her own eyes. "You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry that we thought we were protecting you when we were actually denying you something fundamental that you deserve to know." The apology was more honest and direct than anything William had heard from his family throughout the day's revelations. It acknowledged the harm that had been done rather than justifying it as necessary protection, and it validated his anger rather than asking him to suppress it for institutional convenience. "I don't know how to move forward from here," William admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I thought I knew about myself has been revealed as fiction. I don't know who I am anymore, or what I want, or whether I can continue pretending to be something I'm not." Camilla reached out and took his hands, her gesture carrying the kind of maternal comfort that she had rarely been allowed to offer directly. "You're the same person you were this morning, William. You're intelligent and compassionate and strong and completely worthy of love regardless of who your biological father might be. The DNA doesn't change any of that." William felt something breaking loose inside him, some dam of controlled emotion that had been holding back the full impact of the day's revelations. For the first time since Thomas's devastating revelation hours earlier, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of grief for the identity he had lost and fear for the uncertain future that lay ahead. But, as he stood in the sitting room with Camilla, listening to the storm rage outside and knowing that reporters were gathering to transform his personal crisis into global entertainment, William also felt something else beginning to emerge. Beneath the grief and fear and anger was a growing determination to take control of his own story rather than allowing it to be managed by other people's agendas. The truth was going to come out whether he participated in managing it or not. The only question was whether he would be an active agent in telling his own story or a passive victim of other people's decisions about how that story should be framed. As the storm outside reached its peak intensity, William made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop being managed and protected and spoken for by other people. It was time to find his own voice and use it to tell his own truth, regardless of the institutional consequences. The boy who had been protected from difficult realities was finally ready to become the man who would face those realities head on, whatever the cost might be.